Thank you all for coming. Talk a little bit about the deep western boundary current today. And for those of you who are very knowledgeable on these topics, I will warn you that I've put a little extra introductory material to help out with our new people and our interns that are here this summer. So you may find it starts a little slow for you. Before I get going too far, I wanted to acknowledge the assistance from a large group of people that we're working on together for our SAM project in the South Atlantic. Sylvia Renelis Chenfu, a couple of our colleagues in Argentina, in Brazil, and our technical group who gets us our data and actually keeps our instruments going. So they're all very, very important. And this is all funded by the Climate Program Office and by AOML. So we're going to talk about the Atlantic radial overturning circulation, which most of you know very well about. But again, because we've got some new people here, I thought I'd say a few words about it. There's a cartoon in the top left that shows one of the ways that we do the talk about the overturning circulation, where you've got the warm waters in red flowing northward through most of the Atlantic, and then they sink up in the high latitudes in North Atlantic, and they flow back to the south in the deep layer, which we show in blue in this picture. And they circulate around the globe and eventually come back up to the surface and repeat the cycle. This is a very complex circulation system in reality. This is a cartoon. And one of the things, particularly for our interns, when you see these cartoons, don't believe that we actually think this is what the ocean works like. This is a simplified picture of what the overturning circulation really looks like. It's not quite as simple as what you see there in the top left panel, but nevertheless, it's helpful for us to do that. One of the things that we've learned looking into the meridional overturning circulation over the years is you really need to get measurements all the way across the basin, and you really need to get information about the full water column if you're going to study a circulation system like this. So in the South Atlantic, well, I guess I should back up and say, historically, most of the MOC studies that have been done have been focused in the North Atlantic. That's not because the North Atlantic is actually the most important place. It's because the North Atlantic is the backyard of the countries that have done a lot of the work. And so there tended to be a lot more measurements going on in the North Atlantic from an earlier time period. However, we've been working on something called the SAMOC initiative for a few years now that has been led by Sylvia, and we've gotten to the point where there's actually quite an impressive array of observations about the MOC and portions of the MOC going on in the South Atlantic. That's this picture that you see here in the bottom. I'm not going to go through all of the details, but it involves XBT sections, it involves moorings, it involves repeat hydrographic sections. We've done all sorts of different things, in addition to the long-term observing system programs we have, like our Argo program and the satellite programs that go on, like the altimeter and so forth, that make measurements that are crucial to understanding the meridional overturning circulation in the South Atlantic. So we've really gotten to the stage now where I think we have a fairly impressive array of observations going on in the South Atlantic to study the MOC. This is a slide that's totally unnecessary for most of the people in the room, but why would you study the MOC? Well, the MOC is, you can think of it as the primary mechanism that moves heat around in the global ocean, particularly moving heat north and south. And so why would that matter to you or anyone else? Well, let's think of ourselves here as people living in Miami. If you change the amount of heat moving north-south in the Atlantic, you're going to change the sea surface temperature. If you change the sea surface temperature, that's going to have an impact on the wind shear above the ocean, and that's going to change hurricanes. And those of us living here in Miami care a great deal about what's going on in hurricanes. It can cause us significant trouble. Above and beyond that, it also can change things like precipitation patterns. Hosme, who I don't think is here, did a recent study that connected or showed connections in numerical models between changes in the meridional overturning circulation in the South Atlantic with precipitation patterns in all the areas that you see here in the map. Some of the areas becoming wetter, some of the areas becoming drier. Again, this is going to matter a great deal to us. Our drinking water is mainly coming from precipitation filling up Lake Okeechobee and the neighboring areas. So obviously, if precipitation patterns change, this matters to us, but it matters to a lot of people. This is mattering to people, you know, in the steppes of Russia. I mean, it matters to a lot of people in a lot of different places. So understanding the meridional overturning circulation is quite important. And I stole a bunch of pictures here on the bottom from the internet just to illustrate, if you think about what's the dreadful movie a few years ago, The Day After Tomorrow, I think it was called, where they talked about ice hurricanes and silly things. There was a kernel of truth within the movie in the sense that if we were to slow down the meridional overturning circulation, we would probably be delivering less heat to the northern North Atlantic. And so you might expect to see a great deal more snow and ice and harsher winters in Europe, for example. Because if you look at the globe, England and France are at the same latitude as Canada, but they have a much milder winter now. And a lot of that's due to the fact that the oceans are moving a lot of heat to the north. So if we changed that, this would be an issue. And no, that's not a real picture of the Eiffel Tower, by the way. So somebody had a little fun and stuck an little Eiffel Tower in a snowbank. So what I'm going to talk today about is a portion of the MOC, focusing mainly on the cold deep limb of the MOC. So the blue arrow that was in that, the blue arrows that were in that first map that I showed you earlier. And we're going to look at that in near 34.5 south, which in the map here, those of you that are not intimately familiar with the coastline of South America may not recognize exactly where that is. We're talking the area just east of Uruguay and the southern tip of Brazil, to give you some idea of where we're talking about. And we have a project that we call SAM for short, the Southwest Atlantic MOC project. And we put out a series of moored instruments to study the deep western boundary current and to a lesser extent the Brazil current and the surface flows to understand how it varies over time. We got the program going in 2008 with the purchase of equipment, but we ran into a problem getting a ship in the first year. And so we didn't actually get the instruments in the water until March of 2009. And I'm sorry to say that having problems getting a ship is a problem that has reoccurred more than twice over the course of the project. It's just proven to be one of the big challenges for us to keep this going. But we've got, we deployed the instruments in 2009 in March off of a Brazilian ship called the Cruzeiro do Sul. And the project is a collaboration with partners both in Argentina, led by Alberto Piola, and in Brazil, led by Edmo Campos, who's visiting us here off and on this year. He's not, I think he's in England at the moment, or in Germany or something at the moment. So there's a parallel field project called SAMOC BR that the Brazilians got funded, and in 2012, they deployed these two additional instruments, the blue instruments that you see here, at the midpoints between the two of the four, between three of our four instruments. They actually deployed another one in between C and D, but it hasn't been working yet, so I haven't put it on the plot because we don't have any data from it. So I'm going to talk about two different time periods during the course of my talk here. When I'm talking about only the 4 pies, I'm generally talking about the period from 2009 to the present. When I'm talking about including the Brazilian instruments, I'm talking about December of 2012 to the present. And when I say present, that's also a little bit of a misnomer because the last time we were able to actually get out there and get data successfully with a ship was in October of 2014 for most of the instruments. So the present in this case means October of 2014. Hopefully, knock on wood, we'll be going out to sea on a cruise in September on an Argentine ship, and we'll get the data from all of the other instruments. So what is this instrument called a PIES? Sylvia is totally allowed to fall asleep at this point. And most of the rest of you are familiar with them probably too from previous talks I've given, but for those of you who are not, here's a picture of a pressure-equipped inverted echo sounder. And Yuli's attaching the anchor to this particular instrument. And so what it is, it's a small instrument. You can get a sense of the scale right there next to Yuli. It's a little bit less than a meter in length. It sits or is anchored about 1 meter off the bottom of the ocean. And it sends out, well, let me back up and just go ahead. So the neat thing about these is we can put them out for 4 to 5 years. So it's an unusual instrument in the sense that we can actually get a very long time series from a single deployment. We don't have to take them out of the water all the time. It's making measurements every hour, so it gives you a nice continuous time series for a long time period. And one of the key features of the instruments is you don't have to wait 4 to 5 years to get the data. If you can arrange to have a research vessel over the top of it, it can actually download the data acoustically for the last, say, 6 months or a year since you were there the previous time. And then it goes back into making its measurements. You go off, you've got a year worth of data to analyze and process, and you come back again a year later and do the same thing. And so we're trying to go out and download data every 6 months or 12 months from the instruments. It hasn't been working out quite like that, but that's the idea. That's how the instruments work. They measure 2 or 3 things, depending on whether we're talking about a PIES or a CPIES. A PIES measures round-trip acoustic travel time and bottom pressure. If we talk about a CPIES, which is the instruments the Brazilians have, there's also a current meter 50 meters above the bottom. I'm not really going to talk about the current meter data today, so from now on I'm just going to talk about everything as if they're a PIES. For the travel time, I made a cartoon. So if you had an instrument, basically it's sending out a 12 kilohertz sound pulse that comes out of the instrument. When it transmits the signal, it starts a stopwatch. The pulse goes up to the sea surface, reflects off, comes back down. When it hears the return pulse, it stops the stopwatch. So it's a very simple measurement. How long does it take a sound pulse to go up to the sea surface and come back? And these red lines are supposed to illustrate the main thermocline as it moves around over time, and as the temperature content within the water column changes, or the salinity for that matter, the travel times will change, as illustrated in these panels. So to give you an idea of what the measurements actually look like, these are the actual time series that we have for all of our instruments. The left panel is the travel time measurements. I'm sorry, I didn't actually finish the last slide. Bottom pressure is the other measurement that the instruments are making. So it's making a measurement of the actual pressure that the instrument is feeling every hour as time goes forward as well. So you get the travel time records, the top left, and the pressure records on the right, and those are basically from the top instruments across to the top line is the leftmost instrument, the bottom line is the rightmost instrument. What you can see, so for example, you can see that these two instruments started in December of 2012. These are the two Brazilian additions to the array. You'll also notice a few other things. It turns out, putting moorings in the water and getting data out of them is actually hard. This instrument, which is one of the NOAA instruments, started malfunctioning, wasn't working very well. We tried to recover it in July of 2011, and it ended up in the props of the research vessel that was trying to recover it and was pureed, and that was the end of that. Data is all gone, nothing. We lost everything from that. That's the kind of thing that happens, unfortunately. It was an accident, of course, but it's just the reality. So in 2011 here, we put a new instrument down during that same cruise, and we've got a continuous record, but that hole will show up again throughout many of the time series as I go forward, because it was in one of the middle sites in the array, so it actually makes it very difficult to do most of our calculations during that one time period. You'll also see little gaps in some of these time series. That's all about acoustic download of the data isn't perfect. If it's stormy, If you have got a bad sea state while you're trying to download the data, it can be a little noisy and you can miss things. Those small gaps we're just going to interpolate across linearly. So this travel time thing that I mentioned, it sounds neat, but what's it actually useful for? Well, in and of itself, it's not. Who cares how long it takes a sound pulse to go up and down through the water column? But it turns out that if you take hydrographic observations from the region, if you imagine a CTD profile, if you have temperature and you have salinity, you can calculate a sound speed because there's an empirical equation for that. And so you can integrate that sound speed between the surface and say 1,000 decibars, and you can get a simulated travel time. And if you sort your CTD data or your Argo profile data based on that simulated, you can put together a two-dimensional lookup table for temperature in this case, do the same thing for salinity or density. And you can actually get a lookup table that says, okay, if my inverted echo sounder portion of my pies measured a travel time of this on any given day, that's the temperature profile that would go with it. And you also, for those of you who know a little bit about integrated quantities, an integral quantity doesn't give you a unique profile that goes with it. Normally, there can be an infinite number of profiles that would give you the same integrated heat content, for example. But it turns out the ocean doesn't do that to us, conveniently enough. And you can look at the scatter between the original CTD data and this smoothed lookup table to figure out how big are the errors around it. And that's actually what you're seeing here. Both as an RMS scatter in degrees C and as a signal to noise ratio between the actual observed signal from the gem field, this is what we call a gem field, and the scatter between the original CTDs and the smoothed field. So in general, you can get a pretty good prediction, signal to noise ratios of 10 to 20 to 30 throughout the main thermocline, which is outstanding, and drops down to more like 5 in the mid depths. And then in the deep water, we get fairly low signal to noise ratios. It's not because the errors are big, it's because the signal gets very, very small in the deep ocean. But you would never claim that we can predict details about the temperature signals at 3,500 meters. We can't, because they're very small and they're beyond the capability of the instrument. But we can get ideas, very good ideas, through the upper water column, and we can get and in the mid water column, we can get a decent idea of what's going on. And again, the deep water, the signals are very small, so we can't capture that very well. Anyways, so as I say, we can do this for temperature, salinity, or density. Well, if I can get density, that means I can integrate those profiles and get dynamic height anomaly or geopotential height anomaly. And if I can get that, then if I have two sites, I can take a horizontal gradient between the two and I can get geostrophic velocity. So the inverted echo sounder portion of the pies combined with these hydrography-based gem fields can give me temperature or a velocity profile relative to some assumed level of no motion. And that level of no motion is where the pressure gauges come in. Because if I use a level of no motion at the bottom, I can actually take gradients between the pressure gauges at the bottom to give me an absolute velocity reference that goes with it. So it's that combination of the pressure gauge together with the inverted echo sounder portion that really gives us absolute velocity profiles. There's one little nuance in that the pressure gauges, the differences between the pressure gauges cannot give you the time mean of the absolute velocity at the bottom. So you have to come up with that some other way. And I'll mention briefly how we do that. Before I go too much further though, I'd just like to give you some idea of what the water masses in this particular area look like. And so these are mean temperature top left, salinity top right, dissolved oxygen lower left, and neutral density or density in the lower right. Sections averaging together 4 different cruises that we've done as part of the project. And along the bottom of the panels, you'll see the longitudes where the pies and the sea pies are with the small symbols that you see there. And really, I'm just showing this here so you can see we have, in particular, North Atlantic deep water here. And if you look carefully and you see these darker purples, that's the high oxygen that you would expect from recently ventilated Labrador seawater or recently ventilated North Atlantic deep water more properly. And so we're talking about, you can actually see signatures of the deep waters that are formed way up in the North Atlantic arriving down here with their high oxygen signal because they've been in contact with the atmosphere more recently than the rest of the waters that are in that depth range. So that's one of the ways that you can see the deep western boundary current carrying those northern North Atlantic waters to the south. By the way, if anyone has any questions, any points, feel free to stop me. So, having shown you kind of what the water masses look like in the area, now I'm going to show you what the geostrophic velocities are, because really the heart of what I'm after here is looking at velocities and transports. So the top left is the average north-south meridional velocities for the 5-year period from 2009 to 2014. And so you can see the blues here indicate southward flow, the yellows and reds are northward flow, the white contours are the zeros. So you can see southward flow, it's kind of weak and it's actually very washed out on the screen, I apologize, that's going on here in the this area. Then you have northward velocity again going on offshore, particularly there's a core up in the top, and then again we're reversing to flow offshore. One thing to keep in mind when you see this section is I'm getting geostrophic velocities between pairs of instruments, which means I have 1 profile, 2 profiles, 3 profiles. So there's only 3 vertical profiles in this plot. So it's not like I have a huge number of velocity estimates. I have 3 velocity estimates as we go across here. But because of the nature of geostrophy, those are true integrals between each pair. So it's giving you, we're not missing any flow. We're getting all of the flow. It's just very smooth is what we're getting when we plot like this. Now, we added some additional instruments in 2012, so that can give us better horizontal resolution, which is great, but it's a different time period. So before I show you what it looks like with the additional instruments, I want to show you if we just average over the last 2 years using only the 4 sites, we get something like this, which is similar in most cards, but you see that the flow is a little bit more intense in the upper water column, and you see that we actually get a reversal, a weak reversal going on in the deeper layer if you average only over the last 2 years of data that we have. So it does matter. If we then add these 2 additional Brazilian sites to the array, we get this average velocity. So you can see with the additional horizontal resolution, we see a bit more structure. You can see a little bit stronger Brazil current. Well, you probably can't see it because it's washed out pretty badly, but I'll tell you, trust me, the Brazil current's a little more intense here. Obviously you can see that the return flow offshore is much more intense, and we're seeing kind of a similar transition point where we go from southward flow to northward flow offshore. To kind of illustrate how the horizontal averaging and or smoothing works, this is a meridional velocity section from a 27-year run of the OPHIS model. This is the time mean of it. So in the model, you can see your Brazil current, you can see the kind of our deep western boundary current headed to the south immediately below the Brazil current. And then you get these counterflows offshore. It looks fairly similar to that. In fact, if we average this data between the pairs of instruments in the same way, between the same pairs, we get this, which looks quite similar in nature to that. And then if we use all 6 sites, we see this. You'll notice that the model is a little less intense, pretty much in all depths and at all locations. And that's actually something that we're going to see repeated as we go forward. Just to illustrate kind of one of the fun facts for me, at least, about the data, is I've overlaid here the depth ranges of some of the water masses that are in the deep western boundary current layer. And I'll refer to the deep western boundary current layer as everything below 800. And one of the things, and then I've put on top of it the direction of flow from the mean velocity sections that we were just looking at. So what you can see is the circles are southward, it's flow coming to you out of the page, and the X's are flow going the other direction. And what's neat about this in some ways is that it's counter to what you would expect. So for example, Antarctic bottom water, which is formed around Antarctica and should be flowing northward, in this neighborhood is flowing southward in the mean. Molly?
Just to orient myself, so in the previous picture where you showed us the velocity, it clearly said you only have 3 profiles.
Right, 3, this is now using all, so I've added the Brazilian, so now I have 5 profiles, but yes, it's the same. So there's 1 profile here, that's why there's a 1 vertical line of X's and O's here. And so essentially, between this area, we see the water properties associated with Antarctic bottom water, and in that area, we're seeing a net southward flow. Same thing goes on here. North Atlantic deep water is formed in the North Atlantic, not surprisingly, it flows southward, but in here it's flowing back to the north. So you can see recirculations going on in these areas, and I think in both cases, what we're seeing is a recirculation that's happening in these deep flows. So near the western boundaries, the water properties are not as clear a sign of where the water is going as they might be in the basin interior, I guess is the point. So this is a series of what are called Havemuller plots, which are, in this case, longitude and time. And you'll see a break in the plots where we went from having 4 instruments to having 6. And that's what that break is. And I've just integrated the transports in 3 different layers to illustrate really 2 points. Point number 1 is that there are some features in the transports that are fairly barotropic in the sense that they're affecting all of the layers, but there are others that are not. So for example, here we have an anomalous northward flow in the upper layer between 0 and 800, and you look in the deep flow, there's a much more intense northward anomaly over here on the east side, but here in the center there's really nothing. So this structure does not really look like that structure completely. Other features look very, very similar at different depths. You can see the negatives. For example, there's a peak in the negative here, there's a peak in the negative here in these deeper layers. So that's one point to make, is that while you may get fairly barotropic flows, in many cases it's not always barotropic. Sometimes you do see shear going on between some of these deep layers. The other point that I think is neat is we kind of think of the upper North Atlantic deep water layer being between 2000 and 3200. So if we've got a deep western boundary current carrying that water to the south, which we believe we do, then normally we would expect to see a net flow to the south all the time. But actually, if you look at this time series in that transports integrated in that layer, there are time periods where as we integrate offshore, we actually see a net northward flow in that layer. So it's as if the North Atlantic deep water went away. Molly?
So I must have missed it, but did you explain how you got the net absolute velocity?
Yeah. So the bottom pressure gauges are giving me the absolute velocity at the bottom, sans the time mean. I'm sorry, that I didn't say. I'm sorry, I should have said that. Right. So for the time mean in this particular case, for the absolute the bottom velocities, I'm using the OFIS numerical model, with a long time mean from the numerical model from OFIS to give me that. It's the same thing that we did in our paper a couple of years ago. So it's that'll actually I should have pointed that out actually in that slide. That's what these dashed lines are. I'm sorry, I forgot to actually mention that when that was on the screen. But yeah, so basically we take the agreement here and here, for example, should be good because exactly at that depth and only at that depth, I'm applying the time mean from OFIS to give me the time mean barotropic flow. So only at that particular depth am I forcing the model and the data to agree in a time mean sense.
So how do you know that the model has the deep western boundary current in the right place? Don't have any way of knowing. Although the variability, if you take a look at the variability, in hoping that that's essentially the deep western boundary current meandering and or pulsing or whatever it's doing, the variability lines up reasonably well. So that's the best guess we have. Okay, so you can make statements about that.
Yes.
Not necessarily that we expect to have a deep western boundary current here, but no.
Correct.
That's an artifact completely of the model.
Correct. So, and again, that only applies at 1,500 meters. So if we're looking in the deeper layers, it's involved, but it's not definitive because it doesn't have anything to do with the shear between 1,500 and 2,000, for example, because the model is not used in any way for that. So in that deep layer, yeah. So those are the kind of the two keys here. I guess the other thing I can say is that we've tested more than one model for this, and it doesn't seem to be, at least based on the two models that we've compared it to, the result doesn't change very much. So I don't think it's a question of that time mean is really a dependent feature for the NEMO. It's a French model.
You try to validate them by looking at the shear that you get in the model versus the shear from the observation, since that's the only thing you're actually.
Right. So I mean that's essentially what these figures are trying to show, is that the vertical sections of the model, so all of the right panels are in model. And 50, yes, we do at two locations, but the problem is it's at two locations that are several degrees of longitude apart, and so they're not really representative. They're well beyond the correlation length scales. So it's really, you end up saying, if our instruments are a degree apart, it's 100 kilometers, and we're saying, is a single point current meter representative of that 100 kilometer width? No, it's not. It's what, so we can do some comparisons, and we have. Yeah, and we have. What you find in the current meters, one of the reasons I'm not showing them, is pretty much all you're seeing is the topographic Rossby waves that have been observed in this area before, just has the flow going back and forth along the bottom topography at this location.
But during the cruises, there's a shipboard ADCP which sometimes works, and presumably when you get enough of these cruises doing it, you can also generate an average that way.
Probably the best thing, because unfortunately the Argentine vessels don't have shipboard ADCP, so we've really only got one decent shipboard ADCP off of the Brazilian thing, and that one was kind of sketchy from their vessel. The best thing is, and Danny, who's here working with me this summer, is kind of leading this, is the lowered ADCP sections that we're going to have going forward will probably give us a better test on whether this mean is a good thing or not. So, but that's one of the reasons why I want the focus of this study has to be on the time variability, not so much on the time mean. So, getting back to variability, therefore. This black line here is the time series of absolute transport now integrated from site A to site D, so that's across the entire array, and between 800 and 4,800 decibars, so or the bottom, where the bottom is shallower than 4,800. So what you can see is it's highly variable. You can see over in the left there, the maximum and the minimum are 140 spheredrips apart roughly. So it's highly variable flow in this area. And the mean is around 15 spheredrips, which is pretty close to actually what we would expect for the deep western boundary current and the MOC. It's in the ballpark at least. So again, that gives us some confidence that adding that mean from the model is not giving us something too crazy. The other two lines that you see on this, the red and the blue, are kind of to illustrate why you need absolute velocities in this area. If you go back into our history as a field, there was a lot of calculations relative to an assumed level of no motion. And if you were to assume a level of no motion at 800 decibars, which is kind of what people think of as kind of the bottom of the Brazil current and the top of what's going on below it, you'd get the blue line, the blue dashed line that you see here. And if you compare that to the black line, they don't agree very well. In fact, they don't agree at all. They're not correlated in any way, shape, or form. If you then take that 800 decibar velocity and multiply it by the layer thickness to give you kind of the residual or the reference velocity flow, you get the red. And you can see that the red dominates. Doesn't mean the blue is always trivial. You can see right here, for example, the blue is more than 20 spheredrips. So the baroclinic signal relative to the assumed level of no motion is important, but it's the smaller contributor to the total velocities. So really, in order to get the absolute velocity variability, you have to have absolute velocities. You can't make assumptions about levels of no motion and get anything that looks remotely like what the what the actual deep western boundary current transport in this area is. The other thing is the blue and the red are completely uncorrelated with one another. So it's not like you can make an assumption about equivalent barotropic, for example. You can't do that. The variability is completely independent. So looking at now that we've got kind of 5 years of time series, what can we say about how this energy is distributed in different timescales? Well, if we want to look at the thing that we always look at first, which is the annual cycle, you get this top panel here. So each of the gray lines that you see is the data from one of the years that we have data. And the red line is the average of those. And you look at that and what you immediately say is, we have no idea if there's an annual cycle or not. And if there is, it's we're not capturing it yet. There's no clear annual cycle there. And in fact, if we do a spectra, which is what you see here, semi-annual and annual are the two vertical dashed lines, and you can see that there's not much energy at either of those timescales. So right now we're seeing mainly energy at sub-semi-annual timescales. What's going on there? The gray bar indicates the error bar on that spectra. So you can see it's also kind of sketchy, particularly at the longer periods, because we don't have very many samples at those longer timescales yet. If we break up the energy into period bands, that's another way to look at the same sort of a thing, and what you can see very quickly is the percentage of the total variance that's at the semi-annual period or the annual period is very, very small. The majority of the energy is at these shorter timescales. 60, 70% of the variance is at sub-semi-annual. So a lot of this energy is very high frequency stuff that wouldn't be captured by annual sections or anything like that either. So that's another thing that illustrates how important it is to have continuous measurements over time. Trying to rush along here because I'm going too slow. So can we characterize the anomalous flows? Can we get some idea of what's causing these variations in transport? Well, we try EUFs and they are not statistically significantly different from one another. Basically, that means that that's not going to help us. EOF, for those of you who are not familiar, is something called an empirical orthogonal function. It's a way to try and look for correlated variability in modes, and it doesn't work. So instead of that, what we've tried to do is do composites. And so if we take the transport, and now in this portion I'm going to focus on when we have all of the instruments, because that allows us to look at more better resolved information. If we integrate the transport between 800 and 4800 all the way across the array, we get this time series here, which we've seen a few minutes ago. And if we take a look and see, if we separate out the data that's very anomalously northward and very anomalously southward, so above and below these dashed lines that you can see here, and then we average the velocity sections that we have on those anomalously northward days, which I call weak, and the anomalously southward days, which I call strong. These are the velocity sections that you get. So you can see, for example, on the strong days, you see a much stronger Brazil current. You see stronger flow through all depths. Interestingly, you also see a stronger northward counterflow offshore. And you see a stronger southward flow here, but that's because I'm integrating through this and sorting based on data that's integrated all the way through here. So what you see out of these is that the variations tend to be barotropic. When the deep western boundary current is strong, the Brazil current is strong. That's what you kind of hope that you see out of this. Now, perhaps these structures are because of the definition I'm using, basically integrating and sorting based on the integrated flow in the deep layer. What would happen if I only integrated in here, which is the deep western boundary current itself, not counting the recirculations that are going on to the north? And if I do composites the same way, we get this. So this is now the new time series of flow only between sites A and B, which are these two sites here. And if I sort weak days and strong days from those, what we see is, again, we see a stronger Brazil current, stronger deep western boundary current, but the difference that you see is here. So what you see in this, if we sort it in this manner, is that when the deep western boundary current is becoming more intense, the counterflow offshore is also becoming more intense. We're seeing compensation of sorts going on with this offshore flow immediately when we see the deep western boundary current. And I say immediately, of course, with a mean you can't see that, but we've done lagged correlations to see if there's any indication of a delay between when the deep western boundary current intensifies and when this happens. And there is no meaningful lagged correlations. It appears that this happens almost instantaneously. And that should give you kind of a hint at where I'm going to go with my final point that I'm headed towards here about what's actually causing some of these. But I'm going to let you think about that as we go forward. And we'll see whether we come back with it. In order to really tease out the answer to that question, we need to go into a model because we really just don't have enough data to look at. But before we trust the model entirely, we'll want to do a bit of validation along the lines of what Molly was mentioning earlier. So if we take a look, this is now a 27-year run of the OPHIS model. And if we do this is integrated between the longitudes of our A and D, so this is across the entire array. But if we compare this, and this is the annual cycle that one would see in the model, which is basically there's still no obvious annual cycle. Maybe there's a hint of anomalously northward in the first half of the year and anomalously southward in the second half of the year, but it's still pretty sketchy in my opinion. But what you can see in the model is that the mean A to B transport or this is the data, 17.4, and the model gives us 17.6. The standard deviation in the model from A to B compares quite favorably, but it's slightly lower, 7.6 versus 8.1. If we look at A to D, again, the means are similar. Part of that is because we're using the OPHIS mean, so that's not 100% independent. The variability in the model is much more noticeable, and so there's a similarity to it, but the model seems to have weaker variability. If we break up the baroclinic relative to an assumed level of no motion and the reference velocity in the model in the same way that we've done with the data, you get this figure here. I won't go through all the numbers because I'm running a little shorter on time. But essentially what you find is that the model is underestimating the variability both of the reference velocity and of the relative term. So it's not a question of one or the other being weak. The model seems to be underestimating for both of those terms. If we try and look at the spectra of the model to see how does it agree with the distribution of energy, the top left here is the data. Again, same spectra we looked at earlier. If we use a similar 2-year window, and this is just a little note for those of you doing spectra, really is what this figure is about. If we use a similar 2-year window for calculating our spectra from the model, because we have a 27-year run, that means we have many 2-year windows. So we can do a lot of averaging to get a nice smooth spectra, and that's what you see here as opposed to this. But what you can see also looking at that is that the energy is essentially lower at almost all time scales in the model compared to the data. If we use wider windows with the model to allow us to look at longer time scales than we could with a simple 2-year window, you get this or this, depending on whether you use a 9 or an 18-year window. And what you see two things out of that. One, it becomes much noisier, just like the data, as you would expect, because you have fewer windows to do your averaging of your spectra between. But you'll also notice that the red line here is dropping down very close to 0 at all the longer time scales. So the model is not indicating that there's a lot of energy at the longer time scales. The model's not really finding a great deal of energy. It'll be a few years before we can say the same thing or not from our data time series. We need another decade or two of data collection. All right, I'm just going to skip this because we're running short on time. Basically, what we find in the model and the data is, again, it's a fairly similar distribution of energy and timescales, but we find that the model has much too much energy at the semi-annual and annual timescales compared to the data. And in general, it's underestimating at all the other timescales. It's underestimating what the observations find. So very briefly, these are now Hofmöller plots of the velocity at 2,600 meters, kind of the heart of the deep western boundary current layer from the model. And basically what you see here is that we're seeing westward propagation of features. Some of them show up really nicely in these. So you can see as time increases upward, you can see these westward propagations. This is just 3 different 9-year chunks from the model. And so you can see different events where you can see nice westward propagation. And if you take a look at that and get some estimates of the propagation speeds, it looks quite similar to what you would expect for Rossby waves or Rossby type waves propagating to the west. We also see some eastward propagation in some small events, for example, and those speeds are consistent with what Sylvia had found some years ago looking at topographic Rossby waves that are going on in the deep layer here. So you can see both of these, but the bigger signals that are propagating from further offshore appear to be the Rossby waves propagating in from the interior. And that's quite consistent with what we found in the North Atlantic when we did a similar study a few years ago. So to conclude, basically what we're finding now is that in comparison with the property sections, we find that the deep western boundary current flow structure is actually dominating what's going on here. The water mass boundaries are not dictating the direction of flow in this area, which is not terribly surprising. I think that's similar to what we find in most places when we look in the boundary currents. The western boundary currents tend to not follow, the layers in the western boundary currents do not always follow the water mass boundaries. We find that the biggest variations that we see in the deep western boundary current seem to be immediately partially compensated, at least, by large flows offshore. And if you think about a Rossby wave propagating into this region, you would expect counterflows. And that's why that was the little hint that I gave you earlier about the fact that we were seeing an immediate compensation offshore when we saw a deep western boundary current variation. That's because what we're seeing is a Rossby wave which has both northward and southward flow propagating in, and so you get an immediate counterflow going on offshore when we see these largest variations. And the final point that I was hoping you'd remember is that the high quality models seem to be doing a decent job of capturing the deep western boundary current, and they can help us understand what we're actually seeing. But something that is a concern with the models is they seem to be underestimating energy at most timescales and overestimating the energy at the semi-annual and annual periods. So that's something of a concern for us. I'd like to acknowledge funding both from the Climate Program Office and AOML, and our partners are funded by the universities of Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, and then the Brazilian FAPESP funding agency and the Hydrographic Service in Buenos Aires. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.